Imagine walking into a hospital and walking out with less blood than you had when you entered. In the 19th century, a doctor might look you in the eye, calmly, confidently, and order you to drain your blood into a bowl. Not because of a mistake, not because of madness, but because it was considered a cure. You're getting weaker. Your head is pounding. Your legs won't obey you. And the doctor says, that's a good sign. This is not an executioner. This is not a criminal. This is someone you've entrusted with your life. The smell of metal in the air, the dim light of candles, the darkness creeping in from the edges of your vision. And the scariest thing is, no one is trying to save you. Everyone is sure they're doing the right thing. How much blood can you lose before treatment becomes a sentence? Could you survive it? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the treatment begins with blood, you are still alive, and for now, you are completely conscious. You are sitting or lying down. The wooden bench is hard and cold, even through your clothes. The air in the room is heavy. It smells of old wood, candles, and something metallic. This smell is not harsh. It does not scream. It is simply there. This is the smell of a place where blood is a familiar thing. You hear a sound, not a scream, not a moan, a quiet, rhythmic murmur, somewhere nearby. You do not look in that direction yet, because for now, it seems to you that it has nothing to do with you. The doctor speaks calmly. His voice is even, almost soothing. He does not hurry. A person who is afraid speaks faster. We have to get rid of the excess, he says, as if explaining something simple. Pressure, heat, stagnation. You're not sure you understand these words, but they sound convincing. They have order, and order is what people in the 19th century value most. You're not here by chance. You came alone, maybe because of a headache, maybe because of dizziness, maybe because of fatigue that hasn't gone away for weeks. You live in a world where illness is not a virus or a bacterium. It's an imbalance. The blood is too hot, or too thick, or just too much of it. That's what they've been taught for centuries. That's what they wrote in textbooks. That's how they treated kings, soldiers, children, and women. And you're no exception. The doctor washes his hands, slowly. The metal basin clinks as he places it on the table. You see the bowl, empty, light from within. She waits. Candlelight glides over the metal tool. The blade doesn't shine. It's dull, sharpened not for killing, but for work. You're not really afraid yet. So far, it's just tension, like before an injection, like before a pain that they promise will make quick. Don't worry, the doctor says. Most patients feel relief right away. Most. The word sticks in your head somewhere, because it means there are others. You feel your hand being held, not roughly, but firmly, so that you don't jerk away accidentally. Now you're looking at the bowl, and the sound you heard earlier becomes clear. You realize that it is someone else's blood, somewhere in this same building, today, maybe a few minutes ago. The doctor leans closer. You see his face clearly. It is not evil, not cruel. It is confident. And that is what scares you the most. Because if a person is confident, he does not doubt. He does not stop. He does not think that he could be wrong. You feel the first touch of cold metal on your skin. Not yet pain, just a feeling. The doctor is not looking at you, at your hand, at the vein, at the place where life passes close to the surface. Breathe evenly, he says. You inhale, and at that moment, something important happens. You realize that you can't just get up and leave this treatment. You're already part of the process. You've already given your consent, by the very fact that you came here. You don't scream. You don't flinch. Because society has taught you to tolerate. It has taught you to respect the doctor. It has taught you to trust those who carry knowledge. The first drops fall into the bowl. The sound changes. It becomes clearer, more regular. You look and look away, because your body is still holding on, and your mind already understands that something is wrong. It becomes warm, then a little cold, then strangely light. The doctor nods contentedly. He sees what he wants to see. That's it, he says. Exactly. And you begin to lose track of time. It's not sudden. It's slow, gently, as if someone is gradually dimming the light in the room. You don't know yet that for many people this moment was the last. And you don't know yet that bloodletting is not one movement, not one bowl, not one session. It's a system, tradition, the science of its time. And it doesn't stop, even when the body can't take it anymore. You're still here. But now the question is different, the science that justified blood. What is happening to you is not a coincidence, not a whim of one doctor, not an experiment. It is science. That is what it was believed to be. In the 19th century, blood was not just a liquid. It was a key, an explanation, an excuse. The world of medicine then lived by old laws that no one dared to completely destroy. They were hundreds of years old. They were taught in universities. They were copied in textbooks from generation to generation. The human body, according to these ideas, was a system of balance. 4 juices: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. If something hurt, it meant that the balance was broken. If there was a fever, it meant that there was too much blood. If weakness, the blood has stagnant. If fear, melancholy, strange thoughts, again, blood. It was to blame for almost everything. And if the reason is blood, then the solution seems logical. It needs to be removed. Not all of it, just a little. That's how it was explained. The doctor standing next to you has no doubts. He's done it dozens of times, maybe hundreds. He's seen people weaken, how they turn pale, how they lose consciousness. And he called it cleansing. Because if the patient lay still after the procedure, it meant that the body was resting. If he didn't move, it meant that the treatment had worked. Death didn't always look like death. Often it looked like peace. In medical journals of that time, they wrote neatly, without emotion, without the word error. The patient weakened. The condition worsened. The body could not stand it. Nowhere did they write, "We took too much." because that would mean that the whole system was wrong, and no one could afford that, especially those who were building a career, reputation, name. Bloodletting was a universal solution. It was prescribed to children, pregnant women, soldiers after battle, people with depression, people with coughs, people with insomnia, even those who simply looked overexcited, sometimes several times a week. The body weakened, but the doctor saw in this confirmation of his rightness. You feel it on yourself now. The dizziness becomes deeper. The world seems to recede. Sounds become muffled. You can still hear the doctor's voice, but it doesn't seem so clear anymore. It's like someone has covered him with a blanket. That's normal, he says. The body reacts. It reacts. Nobody talks about a limit, about a point of no return, because that point officially doesn't exist. There's no section in the textbooks, when to stop. There are only instructions, where to cut, how fast, how many bowls on average. And on average is a dangerous word when it comes to life. Some survived, and it was they who were pointed at. See, the method works. People spoke differently about those who were dying, in whispers, or they didn't speak at all. Their deaths were attributed to weakness, to a bad constitution, to the will of God, but never on the blade. You feel your heart beating faster, and then unevenly, as if trying to catch up with what you are losing. You understand one simple thing. This procedure has no built-in protection. It does not know when to stop. It only knows how to continue. And the most dangerous thing, it is supported not by executioners, but by people who believe that they are saving lives. But there is something more to this story, because there were times when even doctors could not close their eyes anymore, when the blood became too much, and silence too, when patients didn't wake up. At first, these were isolated cases. That's what they were called. An unfortunate coincidence, a weak body, a neglected disease. No one was in a hurry to look for a pattern. A person would come to the procedure on their own feet. They would talk. They would joke. They would complain about pain, but they would live. And then they wouldn't wake up. The medical journals would leave dry notes, the date, the age, the amount of blood drawn, and a blank line where the word error should have been. This happened especially often to those who were considered strong, young men, workers, soldiers. Their bodies could withstand more, which meant they took more from them. Another bowl, and some more. Because if a person does not fall immediately, it means that he held on. And if he held on, it means that the treatment is not yet complete. One such case became known far beyond the hospital. A middle-aged man, not old, not terminally ill, complained of fatigue and headache. The doctor decided to act resolutely. The blood flowed for a long time, slowly, evenly. The patient was silent at first. Then he asked for water. Then he said that he was cold. This was considered a normal reaction. When he fainted, the doctor did not stop immediately, because loss of consciousness meant that the body was releasing tension. He was transferred to bed, covered with a blanket. The procedure was recorded as successful. He did not wake up. Death came quietly. No struggle, no screaming, And that was the most comfortable thing of all, because silence doesn't raise questions. But his family did. His wife, his brothers, the people who had seen him alive a few hours before. They didn't understand how a headache treatment could end in death. The doctor explained, calmly, confidently. His heart couldn't take it. Hidden weakness. God's will. And almost always that was enough. But there were more cases. The hospitals began to whisper among themselves. Not publicly, not openly. We had one too. He died after the second session. Strange reaction. Strange meant uncomfortable, because strange things force you to reconsider the rules, and the rules were more important than people back then. The practice of repeated bloodletting became especially dangerous. When the procedure was prescribed again and again, every day or every other day, the body did not have time to recover, and the doctor did not see this. He saw only the symptoms, and the symptoms, in his opinion, confirmed the theory. The person is getting weaker, so the blood was a problem. Is he turning pale? So the cleansing is going well. Can't get out of bed? So the body is rebuilding. That was the logic. But bodies began to appear behind the doors of the wards. Not all of them were recorded as a consequence of the treatment. Some as complications, some as sudden. The words changed. The result? No. And for the first time, fear began to return to those who held the knife. The young doctors noticed strange patterns. Those who survived bloodletting often got sicker. Those who didn't get it sometimes recovered on their own. It was a dangerous thought, because if it was true, then all these deaths weren't inevitable. They were created. And while official medicine remained silent, people began to remember. Names, dates, hospitals. Blood ceased to be just part of the treatment. It became evidence. But there came a time when it would no longer be possible to hide it, because one death would become too public, too loud, too well known. And it would force the world to ask the question it feared most. What if we were treating not the disease, but the person themselves until death? Death that could not be hidden. Up until this point, the system had been holding on. It had been held on authority, on silence, on the habit of not asking unnecessary questions. But sometimes a death comes along that destroys all that at once. This time, the patient was too famous. His name was known. He was seen on the streets. His voice was heard in public. He was not a beggar. He was not a nameless patient in the hospital log. He was a person who would be noticed if he disappeared. He went to the doctor with what was then considered a trifle: weakness, headache, restlessness, nothing that looked fatal. The solution was standard, even cautious by the standards of the time: bloodletting. One procedure, then another to consolidate the result. The doctor did as he was taught, as he always did, as society expected of him. But this time, the body did not obey the script. The patient weakened faster than usual. He complained of cold, of darkness before his eyes. This was again considered normal. When he fainted, the doctor did not stop immediately, because to stop would mean doubting. And doubt is a dangerous thing in a profession that relies on certainty. Death did not come instantly. It crept in, slowly, in front of several people. And that was what became fatal, because this time there were witnesses who did not belong to medicine. They saw the man losing strength, how the skin turned gray, how breathing became shallow, and they heard the doctor repeat, "It's part of the process." When the patient died, it no longer looked like sudden death. It looked like a consequence. The news spread quickly. Not through the newspapers, not yet. Through conversations, through whispers, through fear. He came alone. He was conscious. They helped him. And for the first time, someone said out loud what had previously existed only in their minds. What if this treatment killed him? The doctor tried to defend himself. He spoke the same words as always, about a weak heart, about invisible diseases, about the will of God. But this time, the words didn't work, because the body hadn't been taken away yet, because the bowl hadn't been washed yet, because the blood had not yet become history. And someone asked a question that should never have been asked out loud. "How much blood did you take?" The pause was longer than usual. It was the first cracking sound in a system that had known no resistance for decades. Doubts began to appear. Not immediate rebellion, no, just doubt. And doubt is more dangerous than shouting, because it forces you to look back, to count, to compare. People began to remember others, those who didn't wake up, those who couldn't stand it. And suddenly, it turned out that these were not isolated cases. This was a chain. That day, bloodletting ceased to be just a medical procedure for the first time. It became suspect. But the system doesn't fall right away. It resists. Because at stake is not just a method. At stake is authority, education, the goals of life dedicated to this science. And there will still be a struggle ahead. Sharp, cruel, and not always honest. Because if you admit a mistake, you will have to admit murder. When the system started to defend itself. After that death, something changed. Not on the outside, not yet, but on the inside. Doctors began to speak more carefully to each other. Phrases became longer. Explanations became more complex. When doubts arose, the profession did not stop. It closed ranks. Familiar words began to be heard at medical meetings, but with a new emphasis. The method has been tested for centuries. Individual tragedies cannot cancel practice. Doubts are dangerous for patients. Now the danger was not the blade. The danger was doubt. Because if the patient began to doubt, he might refuse. And if he refused, the doctor would lose control. Control was more important than the truth. Cautious notes appeared in the newspapers. No names, no accusations. Unexpected death during treatment. The body could not withstand the procedure. The words became soft again, smoothed, without sharp edges. But behind the hospital doors, whispers began to sound different. People asked each other, how much blood was taken from him? How many bowls? Was he healthy before this? These questions scared the doctors more than any scandal, because they were the right questions, and there were no answers to them. Instead, new rules appeared, unofficial, unspoken. Don't tell the family too much. Record symptoms carefully. Don't indicate the amount of blood too precisely. Documents became cleaner. Reality was dirtier. Bloodletting continued, sometimes even more often, as if in protest. Because if a method is under threat, it needs to be demonstrated. Show that it works. And for this, examples were found. You can always find someone who got a little better. You can always find a story of success. They were put on display. They were talked about loudly. And about deaths, quietly. You feel it yourself now. It becomes harder for you to breathe. Your heart beats unevenly. The world seems to narrow down to a narrow corridor. The doctor looks at you attentively. Not with fear, with assessment. Maybe a little longer, he says. Because to stop would mean admitting that he could be wrong. And neither education, nor status, nor fear of losing trust allows this. At this point, medicine becomes more like faith than science. And faith, when threatened, rarely behaves humanely. That's when the most dangerous phase begins, when the method is no longer saved for the patient's sake. He is saved for the sake of the method itself. And while the system protects itself, people continue to lose blood. Slowly, legally, under supervision, but somewhere, there are those who are no longer ready to remain silent. Those who begin to count, compare, doubt openly. And this is the beginning of the end. People who started counting. They didn't scream. They didn't go out into the streets. They didn't break down hospital doors. They just counted. They weren't revolutionaries, not rebels. Just the same doctors, with diplomas, practice, and experience. They worked next to those who continued to cut, and they saw the same thing. But they began to notice the difference. In some wards, patients recovered without bloodletting, more slowly, not so beautifully, but they recovered. In others, after the procedure, their condition worsened, systematically, predictably. This was a dangerous thought, because it meant that bloodletting was not neutral. It could be harmful. One of these doctors started doing a simple thing, something that almost no one had done before him. He compared. How many patients survived with bloodletting? How many without? How many died after the first session? How many after the second? The numbers had no emotion. They didn't respect authority. They simply lined up. And this line looked alarming. Those who were bled died more often. Not always, not instantly, but noticeably. Especially weak, especially exhausted, especially those who came to be treated for minor symptoms. This data was not published immediately. They were discussed in whispers, in the corridors, behind closed doors, because to make it public meant challenging not just one doctor, but an entire century of medicine. When someone dared to speak out loud, they were listened to coldly. Your observations are limited. You don't take into account individual characteristics. You risk undermining the patient's trust. Trust. That word again. But now it began to sound different. Because if a patient trusts and is killed by treatment, whose crime is it? Skeptical doctors lost their jobs, opportunities, sometimes their reputations. They were called dangerous, irresponsible, even cruel, because according to the logic of the system, to refuse to cut meant not to treat. But the process could no longer be stopped, because not only doctors appeared, but also patients who began to refuse. They heard the stories. They saw the bodies. They remembered the names. For the first time in a long time, people dared to say, "I don't want this." Sometimes the doctor agreed. Sometimes, no. Because the fear of losing authority was stronger than the fear of the patient's death. you feel how history changes direction. This is not yet a victory, not even a turning point. This is a moment of realization, when it becomes clear that there is no way back. Because if at least one method begins to be checked with numbers, everything is subject to verification. So soon someone will ask the main question: how many people died not from the disease, but from the treatment? When the whole city found out. At first, it was just one article, a small one, without a loud headline. She didn't make any direct accusations. She simply asked a question. Is bloodletting always necessary? Can the increased mortality rate after the procedures be explained? For readers, it was strange. For doctors, it was dangerous. Because a question printed in ink lives longer than any explanation. The newspapers picked up the topic cautiously. Nobody wanted a war with medicine, but nobody wanted to be silent when the stories began to repeat themselves. People recognized themselves, their relatives, their losses. My brother didn't wake up either. My mother became weaker after the treatment. My husband came alone. The words bleeding and death started to appear in the same sentence, and that was enough. The doctors responded publicly, for the first time. They wrote letters, they gave interviews, they explained in complex terms. They talked about coincidence, about improper execution, about incompetent colleagues, never about the method. Because to admit the problem with the method would mean destroying the foundation. But now another force has appeared, the courts. The families began to demand explanations. Not all of them, not immediately. But a precedent has emerged. At the hearings, the same phrases that were previously whispered were heard. He was healthy before the procedure. He weakened immediately after. How much blood did you take? Sometimes doctors answered. Sometimes they evaded, because now every word could be recorded, and what was recorded was used. In the courtroom, bloodletting for the first time looked not as a treatment, but as a risk. Not forbidden, not criminal, but risky. And that word changed everything. Because risk implies choice, and choice means responsibility. Society began to divide. Some said, "It's tradition. It's been treated this way for centuries." Others replied, "But now we know more." Between these two camps were the patients, people who were scared, because now they knew too much to be calm. You feel this tension. Imagine that now, when you go to the hospital, you know the stories. You've heard about the deaths. You've read the articles. But the doctor stands before you again, and again the bowl, and again the blade. Now the fear is not only physical, it is conscious. And this is what changes the course of history. Because the fear that is conscious quickly turns into resistance. And ahead is the moment when someone will dare to say out loud what used to be unthinkable. Or maybe bloodletting doesn't cure at all. When medicine started to retreat. Refusal never begins with the words, "We were wrong." It begins more quietly, by changing the wording, with less confidence. I pause before giving the order. Doctors no longer said that bloodletting was always necessary. Now they said, sometimes, according to indications, with caution. It sounded like progress, but in reality, like retreat. Because yesterday, the method was universal, and today it already needed justification. Notes appeared in textbooks, small, almost imperceptible. In some cases, one should refrain. Not recommended for weakened patients. These lines did not scream, but they were deadly for tradition. Because if someone cannot, then the method is not safe. Strange scenes appeared in hospitals. The patient asks, "Is this necessary?" And the doctor does not answer immediately. He weighs, thinks. For the first time, he doubts. Sometimes he still takes the blade. Sometimes he postpones. And it is at these moments that new medicine is born, not from discoveries, but from refraining from action. Some doctors began to treat differently, to observe, to give the body time. And what they saw was frightening. People survived, without bloodletting, without a bowl, without a blade. Not all, not always, but often enough that it was impossible to ignore. It was the worst discovery of all possible, because it meant that some deaths were not inevitable. They were created. The system began to change, but not to admit guilt. It pretended that the method had simply gone out of use, as if it were a fashion, as if it were a style. No one apologized to the families. No one rewrote death certificates. Blood simply stopped being shed so often, and this silence became a new form of protection. Those who still continued to cut looked more and more lonely, more and more old-fashioned, more and more dangerous. But they still existed, because traditions do not disappear immediately. They cling to life, just like patience on a table. And there was a moment ahead when society would have to decide, which is worse, to abandon the old medicine or to admit that it killed, when the method just disappeared. No one officially declared the end of bloodletting. There was no order. There was no date on the calendar. The method simply ceased to be the first choice. First, the second, then the third, and then none. Young doctors learned differently. Their textbooks were thicker, their lectures more cautious. Bloodletting was spoken of in the past tense, as if it had not taken lives, as if it had not left behind bodies. In hospitals, bowls were gathering dust, blades lay in cupboards. Sometimes they were still taken out of habit, out of inertia, but less and less often. Patients began to live longer. Not always, not all, but it was enough for even those who didn't want to admit it to notice. And that was the verdict. Because when treatment disappears and mortality falls, explanations no longer work. No one came out and said, "We were wrong." Instead, they said, "Medicine is developing. Views are changing. It was a different time." These phrases sound familiar, because they are always used when responsibility needs to be suppressed. The families didn't get answers. The names weren't returned. The records weren't rewritten. The blood was simply washed away by time. But it didn't disappear completely. It remained in memories, in fears, in words. Even today we say, "Let off steam, let it out, relieve the pressure." These phrases are shadows of old medicine. Medicine that believed that life could be saved by letting some of it out. You stand at the end of this story, and suddenly you understand something important. This was not a story about evil doctors, and not about stupid people. This was a story about certainty without verification, about tradition without doubt, about a system that did not know how to stop. And if it could exist for centuries, then what else from our time will look equally scary to those who will live after us? Could you survive it? And would you recognize the danger in time? When the past looks at you, bleeding is gone, but the mechanism is not. It has simply changed form. In the 19th century, danger looked like a bowl and a blade. Today it looks different, but the principle is the same. Authority, confidence. The phrase, "It's the way it is." People who died from bloodletting did not consider themselves victims of an experiment. They considered themselves patients. They trusted. Because trust was the only protection in a world where knowledge was concentrated in the hands of a few. And that's why this story doesn't end in the 19th century. Because the question is not about the method. The question is when we stop asking questions. Bloodletting was not evil. It was logical. In a world without tests, without microscopes, without evidence-based medicine. But logic without testing becomes deadly. Doctors of that time didn't wake up thinking, "Who should I kill today?" They woke up thinking, "I know what I'm doing." And it was this certainty that killed. You understand now that the most terrible decisions in history were made calmly, without panic, without screaming, without doubt. Just another procedure, another patient, another bowl. And if you look closely, we recognize these patterns even today. When complex solutions are simplified, when side effects are silenced, when those who doubt are called dangerous. The history of bloodletting does not teach us to hate the past. It teaches us to fear certainty without control. Because each era is convinced that it already knows enough. And every era is wrong. You no longer look at the bowl of blood. You look at the system that allowed it to be normal. And now the question is different. Would you recognize danger if it came to you in the form of help? Those who said no. They didn't have a majority. They didn't have high-profile positions, and often they didn't have protection. But they did have one thing: the willingness to stop when everyone else was going on. Some of them were doctors. Some were patients. Some were relatives who asked an uncomfortable question. What if we don't cut? What if we just wait? What if the body can handle itself? These words sounded almost heretical. For in a world where action equals care, failure to act looks like indifference. A doctor who didn't bleed risked his reputation. A patient who refused risked being left without help. But this was where the change began. Those who said no started to survive no worse and sometimes better. Without a bowl, without a blade, without loss of strength. These cases did not fit into the old theory, and so they tried to ignore them. But ignoring the living is harder than ignoring the dead. Over time, these exceptions began to repeat themselves. They became too numerous to be written off as coincidences. And then the system did what all systems do under pressure. It rewrote history. Bloodletting was not banned, it was simply pushed aside. It was made archaic, outdated. And those who had once spoken out against it were called prescient, as if they were always right, as if there was no risk, as if they did not pay for it with careers, money, peace. But there were others, those who said no too late, those who understood the danger when the body could no longer regain what was lost. Their stories did not make it into textbooks, because textbooks do not like belated insights. And yet, it was these people who changed the course of history more than any orders, because they proved a simple thing. Survival sometimes begins with refusal, not with action, not with treatment, but from the moment you say, "I do not agree." And now there is the last step left. Not about doctors, not about patients, about you. Could you survive this? Imagine being there again, not in the past as in a museum, but in the past as in the reality where you live. You don't know the future. You don't know that bloodletting will disappear. You don't know that one day it will be called a mistake. You only know what everyone around you knows, that the doctor is an authority, that tradition is proof, that doubt is dangerous. You feel weak, a headache. Your body is failing you, and they offer you help, not with malice in their voice, not with threats, but with confidence. You look at the bowl, at the blade, at the hands that have done this hundreds of times. And here's the main question of this story. Would you recognize danger if it looked like care? The people who died from bloodletting were not stupid. They were not naive. They did the same thing you would do. They trusted the one whom the whole world trusted. And that's why this story is not about the past. It's about survival. That sometimes the most terrible threats don't hide in the dark. They stand in the candlelight, in clean lab coats, with the right words. Bloodletting took lives not because it was cruel, but because it was normal. History repeats itself not when new evil appears, but when we stop asking questions. You're not in that room anymore. The bowl is empty. The candles went out. But the question remained. Could you survive it? And would you realize you were being killed before it was too late? This is not a horror story. This is history.